All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, so glad you're here. Thanks so much for coming along. I know there's like a bunch of other talks that you could have gone to, so I'm excited that you came to see mine. Frictionless front ends for back-end developers. I promise it'll be fun. Well, I think it'll be fun. It'll be fun for me. I don't know if it'll be fun for you, but hopefully it is. So just a couple of things about me. My name is Mandy. I'm a front-end developer. I'm also a dev manager for a news organisation in Australia. I speak at a bunch of conferences in Australia and overseas about the front end. I like to play with sensors and browser APIs and fonts and all sorts of stuff. And I also write a bunch of blog posts and stuff about the front end as well. So I feel like I'm qualified to talk to you about building front ends. My talk is pretty much things that I have taught back-end developers that I have worked with. A large portion of this talk is stuff that I've taught one specific developer that I work with. His name is Jake. Actually, he's presented at NDC before, and he has been my willing test subject for about 3 years now. Very importantly, before we get into the talk, this is my dog Jello. And this is important because my demos use what I call Jello Ipsum, which is fake text about my dog. So when you see it, you'll know that I'm talking about him and not about the food Jello. So you can imagine this cute face as we go on. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm Mandy_Kerr. I am wearing a bat mask in my profile picture, so it's super easy to find. If you have any questions, things that I haven't answered, you can either come and speak to me tomorrow, or you can message me on Twitter and I will happily help you out. So when I talk about the front end, I am specifically referring to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. For the purposes of today, because I only have an hour, we're only going to talk about HTML and CSS. And the reason for that is because I find backend developers tend to pick up JavaScript relatively easily in comparison to HTML and CSS, which I think because the mental model around thinking about HTML and CSS is quite different to JavaScript, which is similar to other programming languages. People tend to struggle a little bit with it. So we're going to focus on improving the presentation and UI layer of building websites or web applications. And I will give you some little tips and tricks that everyone can follow for design purposes. Because the backend developers I know are always like, I can't design, I don't know how to do that. But you can, because design is just about patterns and systems. And we're developers and we love patterns and systems, so you can absolutely do it. So this is what we're going to talk about. Whenever I have worked with backend developers and on teams where they're heavily resourced with backend developers, they typically will rely on UI kits like Bootstrap. That is totally fine. I don't want anyone to feel bad about using Bootstrap. However, there are some problems with using something like Bootstrap. And the most obvious and biggest problem with it is if you think about how you build the rest of your tech stack. At the beginning of the project, you know the least about it. So you start small and you build on top of it. You add the things that you need as you go. A UI kit is the opposite of that, where you typically take the whole thing, all this stuff, whack it in your project. Maybe you need it, maybe you don't. Then, when you want to change stuff, you add more stuff on top of that. And then all of a sudden, you've got this really hard to maintain, unusable front end. And then you're like, the front end sucks. So hard to use. Well, that's because you went around about the wrong way. So what we're going to do is, in the next 50 minutes, we're going to build this page. It's kind of like a web page / admin system featuring a bunch of things. We're going to use under 200 lines of CSS. It's going to have a bunch of reusable styles that you can change the content to do different layouts. And as I said before, I'll teach you some design tips along the way. So hopefully, you'll get a bit of an understanding of the different things that you can do on the front end. Before we get into talking about HTML and CSS, I'm going to briefly take a detour and talk about typed languages. Who here has used a typed language like TypeScript or something? Great, so most people. This is going to make it so much easier to explain. So for the few people that did put their hands up, a typed language basically makes use of static typing, so we can assign a type to our data. It'll check the type at compile time, and if the value it receives doesn't match the value that we assigned, it'll be like, you can't do that, doesn't work. So for example, we might have an interface of dog. Name, age, is Fluffy, my dog is Fluffy. If I assigned a string to is Fluffy, it would be like, you can't do that, I want a Boolean. Essentially, we're being explicit about the shape of our data. We're telling TypeScript what we expect it to be. And we do this to make debugging, reading, writing, and working with our code a lot easier. This is essentially what we do when we write HTML. In HTML, we specify whether we want something to be a header, a footer, a link, a video, an image, a caption, whether it should be bold or italic. There are a whole suite of elements you can use in order to best represent your content. And we do this for similar reasons as to why we use TypeScript, to make reading, working, writing, and debugging our code a lot easier. But in the case of HTML, it's not just for the developer. It's also for the technology that consumes your HTML. So for example, the browser. When the browser hits a heading 2 or an image or a video, it knows what to do with those because it knows what it is. The same thing applies to technology like screen readers for accessibility. When a screen reader hits a button, it's able to tell the person using the technology what to do with that button, that you can submit something. This also applies to other text-to-speech technologies like Google Home, Alexa, Siri. When they read HTML, if they know what the elements are, they know what to skip, and they know what to read out, and what importance is associated with the different content. Along with this, you have other technology like reading modes in Safari, which will strip a bunch of stuff out that's not important and leave you with just the important parts. It can only do this if you use HTML correctly. And the same thing applies for automated testing. If you use HTML the way that it was intended, automating testing becomes a lot easier. Now in TypeScript, there's the concept of the anytype. When you assign a type of any, it means it can be anything. If you do this everywhere, you obviously lose the benefits of the language. You don't get the safety that TypeScript provides. So it kind of becomes pointless because it can be anything. This is exactly the same if you use divs everywhere in HTML. It's really important that you actively choose the correct HTML element, because if you use a div, you're using a generic element. And if you use a generic element, you get generic output. So at this point, I'm not going to go through all the HTML elements that exist. You're developers, you can read specifications. MDN, great website, go there, check it out. But there's a couple of things I want to really point out. Make use of sectioning elements. They pretty much do what they say. Section marks up a section. Article marks up articles or blog posts or things like that. Nav, navigation. Aside, a sidebar. They're going to do what you expect. And what these do is tell different technologies what the most important thing on the page is. So for example, if you had an article element and a sidebar element in a reading mode, it would ditch the sidebar and take just the article. It would also ditch the nav because that's not important in a reading mode. If you don't have these, it takes everything and it all munges together in unformatted text and it's really hard to use. You should also define a clear structure and hierarchy. You can do this with sectioning elements, but you can also use things like header and footer, as well as the headings, which are H1 to H6. This is so important, everybody. The headings are numbered for a reason. You should use them in order. So H1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you go 6, 1, 2, 4, 3, that's the wrong order, and you mess everything up. So make sure you use the headings in the number order that's provided. And most importantly, never choose an element based on what it looks like in the browser. People do this with headings all the time, and I get the desire to do that, but the styles that are applied to headings by default are suggestions, not rules, and CSS is there to change it. So always pick an element based on how it best represents the content. And finally, the most important part to remember about HTML is to make the most of its built-in functionality. Native HTML elements give you so much free stuff. If you don't want to be working on the front end, the best thing you can do is use HTML to its maximum power, because it means that you don't have to write a bunch of stuff. So if, for example, you're using a button, most people I have found will make a div and add an on-click handler, and then they add all the features in that the browser would have just given you if you just use a button. Buttons and links will take focus by default. They will also can be submitted with the enter or the spacebar key. Heaps of free stuff that you get. If you try and make this on your own, typically you have to write more CSS, more JavaScript, and more HTML to get it to work. And nobody wants to do that because that's boring. So make the most of what HTML provides you. Another important thing to note about this is when people make libraries like the millions and millions that exist on NPM, most of the time they assume that you're going to use the language appropriately. So if you don't use HTML properly, and then you try and install these libraries, often you're going to have to do more work to get it to work. So make the most of built-in functionality, make your life easier, and you get lots of free stuff. So this is the HTML we're going to use. This is what it looks like with just divs. And this is what it looks like with proper HTML. One of these looks better than the other, just straight from the get-go. It's this one, just in case. So this is what we're going to start with. Just checking. But yeah, this is what we're going to start with, and we're going to style it up. But before I do that, I know that we all have a shit ton of stuff to learn. I mean, at this conference, how many tracks are there? Like 5? Heaps of stuff to learn, right? I'm not expecting everyone here to remember everything all the time. There are tools for that. Google's Lighthouse tool will generate reports over your code. It's not going to pick up everything, but things like performance, accessibility, best practices, SEO will pick up some things for you around misuse of HTML. It has a browser extension, but there's also a command line tool that you can tie in. The added bonus is that you can improve like the performance and stuff of your website or application as you go as well, which is great because most websites these days are shit on performance and accessibility. Even the one that I work on, shame for a moment there. All right, our HTML page. This is going to be fun. What we're going to do now is style it up, and the rest of the talk is going to be about CSS. I want to make something really clear right now. I don't give a shit how you write your CSS. You can use Sass, Stylus, Less for preprocessors, straight up CSS, a CSS and JS library, post CSS, whatever. They are implementation details. It doesn't really matter to me how that works. As far as I'm concerned, they're all the same. However, I have found that when working with backend developers, and particularly people who have worked on the backend and write a lot of JavaScript, CSS and JS is a lot easier for them. And the reason for that is because CSS and JS will scope your styles to a component. And what this does is it limits the impact of things in CSS like the cascade, inheritance, and specificity. And if you don't know what those things are, CSS and JS might be for you. However, what I would say is that CSS is very, very powerful. And if you understand things like the cascade, it will make your life significantly easier, especially if you have to work with third parties like ad tech, which really sucks, or video players. I have found that in the team I work in, there is one person that can debug that stuff, and it's me. The rest of the people in the team don't really understand how the cascade and that kind of thing works, so they get really stuck in a bad place. So if you want to make the most of it and use it to your advantage, like it's kind of like being given a sword but not being able to use it properly. If you know how to use it, you can just be like, foo, 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 and you'll do an awesome job. So that's not how you sword fight. I understand that, but I'm a CSS front-end developer, not a sword fighter. If anyone is a sword fighter, come and teach me. That would be awesome. Then I can get a real sword and it'll be cool on stage. Okay, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. This is why I need to do practice runs of my talk, because I tend to get distracted and ramble a bit. Anyway, CSS is awesome. This is going to be fun. So what we're going to do is start with building the layout. Now, we're going to use CSS Grid for this. Prior to CSS Grid, there was many totally whack ways of dealing with layouts on the web. Tables, floats. It was a nightmare, and we did the best we could with the things that we had. But CSS Grid was developed with building layouts on the web in mind. The support in browsers for this is excellent. All the major browsers support it. The caveat on IE11 is that the syntax is slightly different, but there are ways to deal with that. So it's like, I don't know if you can see this, but I've like half got IE there, because it's sort of half, it's kind of like IE in general, really. It's like half there. Doesn't really matter now, though, because these are the main ones. We're going to build this. We have a header, navigation, main content region, sidebar, and footer. We're going to start with the columns first. We've got 3 columns, 2 fixed width columns and a fluid column in the middle. And the way that we do this with grid is we have a property called display grid. Can you see that in the back? Cool, awesome, nailed it. The second and the most important part here is grid template columns, which is the property that is going to define how we set up our columns. Now, because we've got 3 columns, we have 3 values. The 2 fixed pixel units, so 200 pixels is our navigation and 250 is our sidebar. This unit in the middle is special. It was introduced with CSS Grid and it's called a fraction unit. And what it does is it represents a fraction of the available space in the container. So in this case, whatever's left over once the 450 pixels is removed from the viewport. The next thing we have to do is make this header span 2 columns. The way we do that in CSS Grid is we say grid-column, start at 2 and span for 2. The reason it's a 2, I'm not really sure why, but the index starts at 1 instead of 0, which for a lot of developers is a bit confusing because normally the index starts at 0, but I guess it made sense when they were developing it. A good way to debug this if you're having problems, Firefox has a great grid inspector. And along the top, there are numbers, starting at 1 and going to 6. And these identify the tracks in the grid. So for our code, we're saying start at 2, which is here, next to the portrait of the dude. And then we're saying span for 2. So we span the dude, and then the carpet. I think that's a carpet, the weird carpet thing. And that's what that code does. The Flexbox grid inspector is really, really awesome. It's really great if you're going to be working with CSS Grid because it'll tell you when you've totally messed up, and you can see where you've made mistakes. So now we've done that, we'll do our rows. I'm not going to show you what it looks like yet because it looks a bit messy. We need to do the rows first. They're actually really similar to the columns. We have 2 fixed height rows and a fluid one in the middle. So the way we do this, grid template rows, 2 fixed pixel values and a fluid one in the middle. Then what we need to do is span the rows with our nav and our sidebar. At this point, I want to explain something about how the flow of HTML elements works in the browser. So the way that this actually flows in order is header, navigation, main content, sidebar, footer. So when we moved the header across, right here is an empty space. So what we need to do is move the nav into that empty space. Whereas in this case for the sidebar, it's already where it needs to be in the flow of the document. So we don't actually need to move it anywhere. We just need to tell it to span 2 rows. So the code for that would look like this for my nav. Grid-row, start at 1, so the top, and span for 3. And with the sidebar, we can just say span for 2, because we're making the most of the way that the document naturally flows. If I defined a start point for this, I would also have to do it for the main content region, because otherwise it wouldn't be in the natural flow anymore. So by doing it this way, you're working with the browser, not against it, and you can write less code. So this is what it looks like. I've added some color so that you can see. So it's okay, but we need to do something with this middle bit because that looks messy. So from the word marshmallow down, we're going to do this. Man, my jet lag just kicked in. Holy moly. Okay, it's all right, I got this. 17-hour flight from Perth, my friends. Direct, no stopover. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah. So from marshmallow down, we're going to do this. I have one container that's going to span 3 columns, and then everything below that is going to just line up. And important to note, there are gaps between these items. So when we do our grid, we say display grid. Grid gap, 18 pixels, nice and easy. And then grid template columns again. But you'll notice this is very different to what I just showed you. That's because this is like the best CSS magic in the world. I actually tweeted an article about this on Medium today, so you can go and read that later if you want. But there are 3 main parts to this. And what this will do is this will make it work regardless of how many columns there are. So you know, if you've got a product page and you might have 6 items or 127 or 40, this will work regardless. It will also be responsive without breakpoints. So it will just work regardless of the size of the viewport, which is what makes it super duper amazing, because breakpoints suck. So the 3 main parts of this is the repeat function. It does what it sounds like. It will say, for however many items there are, repeat the following pattern. Then it takes 2 values. These values can be a whole bunch of different things, but for the purposes of today, we're going to pass in autofill. And what autofill does is it fills the row with as many currently available items as they are, and it expands them to fill the available space. And then the last thing is the size. So instead of min-max, we could just put a fixed value in, or we can use min-max, and we can say, I want this content to be a minimum of 230 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction. What this will then do is make sure the items don't get smaller than 230, so it doesn't get all squishy. But if they don't fit on 1 row and fill the space, it'll just make them bigger to fill whatever space is left over. So it'll look like this. The last thing we need to do is make marshmallow span 3 columns. Now you're probably thinking, well, we could go 1 span 3. But because this could be any number of columns, we can't do that. Because if it was only 2 columns or if it was 4 columns, it would no longer span correctly. So instead, we can say, find the first child of my group of stuff, start at 1, and span to the end, which is what -1 basically means. And this will mean that it works with any number of items at any viewport size, however you need it to be. So that will give us this. And just to prove to you that it's responsive, magic. So the problem with the original stuff that I did with the outside is that we need to add breakpoints in order to get rid of the sidebar or hide the nav as the viewport gets smaller for mobile. But with this code, we don't need to do that because it'll just work for us. So a couple of lines of CSS will give us a flexible, fluid, totally responsive web page with very little effort. CSS Grid is awesome. And you can use it for all sorts of things, forms, cards, whatever. The CSS that I presently have will also allow me to set up a form like this. That full width, I changed from using first child to a class, and then I can apply it anywhere. And then I can just use the code that I've written to autofill to create all of the columns. As far as resources go, Grid by Example is free, heaps of code snippets you can just copy and paste. It's done by Rachel Andrew, who basically is the reason we have CSS Grid in the browser, because she hassled all of the browser vendors about adding it in. Every layout.dev is pretty much what it says. It's a resource for every layout that you might want, which is great. Some of them are paid and some of them are free, but it has really good explanations of why things work and how to use them, so I highly recommend. So, just a little check-in. This is where we are now. There is a very obvious problem here, and I'm just going to let you look at it for a sec. If you build web applications, you probably noticed it first. It's this white space at the bottom, which looks like trash. We don't want that. We want it to be full height. And I know some of you, if you've done stuff on the front end, you're like, well, that's easy. We can just go height 100%. And that's true, you can. But the problem with height 100% is that it actually has to be on every single parent item in the page, and that includes the HTML and the body element. And most people don't realize this, so they just put height 100% on everything until it works, and then nobody wants to touch the CSS anymore because they don't know if it's going to break or not. So if you understand that that's how height 100% works, awesome. Otherwise, CSS implemented some new units called Viewport units. So you have the viewport height, which is VH, and the viewport width, which is VW. And they represent a percentage of the total viewport height or width. So for example, 10 viewport width is 10% of the current viewport width. With these units, on the container that wraps our page, you can say height, 100 viewport width. And that will do it for you. One line of CSS, no faffing about with parents. It'll just work. Magic. Okay, this is looking way better. So what we're going to do now is we are going to do something about this weirdness that's going on here. And to do that, we're going to use Flexbox. Now, often people think that with CSS Grid, you don't need Flexbox, but that's actually not true. They are both useful, and you can use them together. So we're going to use Flexbox to align content within our grid. Flexbox works in all of the major browsers, including IE11. The only caveat I would add is technically it's classed as partial support because it's full of bugs. There is a website called Flexbugs, which is on GitHub, which lists them all and tells you how to fix them, so it's not that difficult to get around, but in true IE11 spec, it is a little bit of a pain in the butt. So we're going to move the links up onto the same line as the headline using Flexbox. But before I do that, I want to explain a couple of things about Flexbox because it always confuses people, and then they are faffing about in CSS and not really knowing what they're doing and doing the same thing we did with height. Lots of front-end developers don't understand this either. That's how confusing it is. But I'm going to do my best to make it not confusing for you. So we have a div. And inside the div, we have a paragraph. Jello is a fluffy fellow. Jello ipsa. So we have display flex. And then we're going to say align items and center. And that is going to center it vertically within the div. Then I want the text to be horizontally aligned. So I'm just going to go text align, center. And that will center the text within the paragraph. The problem with this is the paragraph still stretches full width. If I want the paragraph to be centered, then you can use another Flexbox property called justify content. And justify content center will center the whole thing in the middle. Great. But justify content does a whole bunch of other things as well. So I can demo this to you, I've split them out into two paragraphs, Jello and Marshmallow, respectively. And if I change justify content to flex end, it'll move the items to the end. Flex start moves it to the start. Space around is going to evenly distribute the space around the items, and space between will evenly distribute the items with space between them. Justify content is horizontally aligning the items. What's important to understand about Flexbox is by default, the flex direction is a row. So justify content horizontally aligns. If you change it to a column, justify content justifies it vertically instead of horizontally. So again, I've split the text up so that you can see how this works. But if I change justify content on a column instead of a row, flex end, we'll put it at the end of the column. Flex start puts it at the start. Space around and space between will vertically distribute the items in the div. Now you're probably thinking, that's weird. Why did they do that? And the reason for this is that not every language on the web reads left to right. Some of them read top to bottom. Some of them read right to left. So when the spec is written for CSS, it has to account for every language in the world. So it allows you to determine the main axis of the text. So if it's a row, it aligns vertically and justifies horizontally. If it's a column, it justifies vertically and aligns horizontally. So for us, we say display flex, justify content space between, so it'll push the link to one side and the heading to the other, and then we'll say align items center. And that will give us this, which is looking way better. So what we've got to do next is fix the horrible lack of spacing. And we're going to do this with margins and padding and that kind of thing. But first I want to talk about variables. We use variables in CSS for the same reason that we do in other programming languages. It helps us to reduce duplication, to ensure consistency, and make maintainability a lot easier. It doesn't matter how you write your CSS. There are ways to do variables in all versions. In CSS, they're called custom properties, and that's the top row. And there's a var function that you can use in order to reference it. Custom properties can be edited by JavaScript, which is what makes them really cool. In preprocessors, like this one is Sass, uses a $sign. They are compiled, so they're static, and you can't change them with JavaScript. And then the bottom one is JavaScript, and obviously you can change them with JavaScript, because it's JavaScript. And it does all the things. So with this in mind, there are a few areas that variables are really useful for. Things that define the system that I mentioned earlier, margins and padding, colors, fonts, that kind of thing. Good design is based off systems. And the best example of this is when you set up consistent spacing. So for example, these are spacing values from the website that I work on. It's one of our news websites for our organization. And you might have noticed that they're multiples of 9. And the reason for this is that when we look at things visually, we like patterns and we like rhythm. And multiples of a number will give you that. You could also use the golden ratio or the Fibonacci sequence. These kinds of things help to create a consistent rhythm in the page. And people like that. You might not know why it looks nice, but you know that it does. So if you set up a consistent spacing, multiples of something, whatever, use them consistently and don't just add random values willy-nilly, which a lot of people do. Stick to these, you'll end up with a much nicer design. So the way that I picked what these should be, I kind of picked what I thought nice, but there are a few tips that you can follow. Use small values between headings and paragraphs. So for example here, you want the content to look like it's related and not that it's really far apart, but not so close that it runs into each other. Use large values between sections, like between here. This helps to separate the content without the need for dividers. Something like 18 pixels I would consider like an anchor value, because it's used mostly throughout the whole page. And the reason for this is when you continue to use a value, it ties the page together and ends up having a nicer feel to it. It's this kind of rhythm thing that I was talking about. And most importantly, stick to the consistent set of values that you've defined. Don't just add a bunch of new ones in out of guessing. So the next thing is colors and fonts. Now when it comes to colors, I kind of already picked these because I like purple. That was pretty much how I worked it out. With the links, I went with pink because it kind of goes with purple. I'll talk about color in a sec. But when it comes to fonts, there's a few tips that you can follow. Draw attention with a large font size. So for example, Welcome Jello. For things that aren't as important, use a smaller font size. So for example, I made the link here smaller because it's supplementary information. Same with timestamps. Not as important as the recent activity text, but still valuable. So make it a bit smaller so that it doesn't compete with the text around it. Link colors should generally be consistent. So don't put 27 different colors in for links. People tend to expect consistency in your designs. So same with buttons, have one or two, but don't go nuts with it. Make sure you're using the same value everywhere. And most importantly, have a color palette. And if you don't know how to pick colors or what a color palette is, there's a heap of websites. This one I really like because it's called Coolers. And you can go there and they've got a best and picks option. Just go to that because these are the ones that most people like. Pick one and that's your color palette and use those within your design. What's great about this site is it also gives you information on the color contrast, so what it looks like with people who have different forms of color blindness. So you can see if people can distinguish between colors and what it looks like to them. So you can make a more accessible website with that as well. Okay. Next, I want to talk about nav, specifically that thing over in the top. What is that for you? Left, the top left. I'm not going to tell you how to style lists because we don't have time for that, but there's a couple of things I want to specifically mention about nav that catches people off guard a little bit. If you've ever looked at nav in CSS before, you'll notice that the links almost always have display block. And the reason for this is because by default links are display inline. And an element that is display inline can only take up as much space as it needs, is always displayed side by side, so like in paragraphs. You can't set a width, height, or top and bottom value on it for margins, and it can't contain block level elements. Links are a bit of an exception to that block level elements thing. People were constantly wrapping block level elements in links, so they just kind of made it work because it was inevitable, and they were like, okay, fine, you're going to do that, we'll make it okay. But if you wrap a link in a block level element, then you need to make the link a display block, otherwise it'll render weird. Block level elements, on the other hand, can take up the full width by default. They're displayed on a new line, you can set a width and a height, and it can contain other block level elements and it'll all work great. Visually, it looks like this. So the inline one, they're stacked on top of each other because they're in a list element, which is block level. But the red is the clickable area. So with display block, you can see there's a much larger clickable area than with inline, which is what we want for nav, right? Because people have fingers on mobile and they're trying to click things. The larger the space, the easier it is for them. As a quick aside, Firefox, at the end of last year, introduced the contextual information panel. It will tell you if you've added a property that's not going to do anything. So in this case, if you try to add a height to an inline element, it'll be like, hey, that's not going to work. Have you tried this? It's really cool. It's very new. They keep adding stuff. But if you get stuck and not sure why something's not working, you can always open it up in Firefox and see if it'll give you a bit of a tip on how to improve it. It's super awesome. I think this is one of the best features that Firefox has added, because as a side effect, it'll also tell you what CSS you can delete from your code. So once we've added display block, there are two things that we want to do. First, we need to change the color to white. And the reason we have to do that is because I've already told my page that I want all my links to be pink. So I have to override that. Secondly, we're going to add padding of 18 pixels. And the reason that we add padding and not margin is because when you add padding to an element, it kind of adds it to the inside, whereas margin sort of adds it to the outside. So again, the red area is the clickable area, which is why padding is what we want. Margin is good for putting space between items. Padding is good for making an item bigger. Finally, the last part is adding the interactions. You should always add a hover and a focus style to your links and your nav and your buttons because it tells people that they're interacting with it. I've changed the background to pink on hover and blue on focus. And again, I have to set the color to white because I've already got hover and focus states for the rest of the links in my page. So that's going to give us this, which is great. One last thing you can do to make it look a bit special is add a transition property. If you add transition, this will animate between the colors. So in this case, I just want to animate the background. 250 milliseconds is a pretty standard value that you can use, although you can change it to whatever you want. I wouldn't go longer than 250 milliseconds because then it will just be painful because you'll be watching it and it'll be going, and that'll be like really annoying. So I'm just going to use ease as the timing, and it'll look like this. Oh, much prettier. Very nice. It makes it look a bit more finesse and a bit more professional. Don't overdo transitions and animations because that's annoying, but you can do it on buttons, links, form elements when you click into them, that kind of stuff. Okay, so now I want to talk about images, and specifically there's one thing I want to talk about because it's a new feature that was added. Now when you load images, it kind of does what this just did. It's my dog when he was a puppy, super cute. What happens is the image will not be there, and then it'll load, and then it'll push all the content down the page. This is really bad for performance because anything that it's pushed needs to be redrawn by the browser. And this is bad because it ties up the browser's processing. And if you have a news website, for example, like we have, and it's got hundreds of pictures on it, this really, really has a negative impact on how your site renders. So the way that we used to resolve this problem is we would either add a width and a height onto the image element or a width and a height in the CSS. And this would predefine the space and then load the image in that. And that would stop the page from having to redraw everything. The problem with this is because we do responsive sites these days, if you set the width to be 800 pixels and then the viewport was 400 pixels, it wouldn't work anymore. So then we implemented all these weird-ass padding hacks to determine the aspect ratio using pseudo elements. And although it technically works, it's absolutely a hack. So as of December last year, a new thing was implemented called, it doesn't actually have a name, it's intrinsic mapping of aspect ratio to image elements. That's the name of the bug page. And what this will do is if you add a width and a height to the image, and then you use percentages in your CSS, the percentage will override the width and the height, but it will use the width and the height to determine the aspect ratio of the image. And then it'll give you the nice predetermined space and load the image into that. This is kind of why Facebook, for example, has these grey boxes everywhere and then loads stuff in. They're preventing the page from redrawing. The browser support for this, Chrome and Firefox both support it. Edge, I'm pretty sure landed last night. I haven't had a chance to check, but just last night it got support. And for Safari, it's currently in their preview version of their browser, so it will be supported soon. If you add this to your images on your site or application, it's going to massively improve the performance. So I've added a jello in for fun. All right. So the last thing that I want to talk about is sticking things. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. I'm going to tell you a little story. We were building something at my work, and we needed to stick something. So one of the devs picked it up, and they wrote the most beautiful JavaScript you've ever seen to stick this thing in the browser. Because that's how we have typically stuck things on the web before, with JavaScript, a bit of CSS, maybe some extra HTML for containers. But it has always been quite buggy, especially with responsive sites, because you have to recalculate everything when it resizes, and it's never been super smooth because you're obviously redrawing things in the browser whenever you scroll or move stuff around. So CSS, the spec writers were like, ugh, people like to stick things. So my awesome developer wrote this beautiful code, and I was like, this is awesome, but you could do this with 2 lines of CSS. And he was like, are you kidding me? What? I was like, I'm really sorry. You spent all that time writing all that beautiful JavaScript, but actually we just need position sticky and a top offset of 0, or whatever offset you want. And what that will do to our nav, which is when you scroll, it'll just stick to the top. Now, if you change the offset to 20, it'll be 20 pixels from the top, that kind of thing. So 2 lines of CSS now will stick something in your page. The only thing you have to remember is that it needs a channel to move through. So whatever the size of the parent container will determine how much it sticks. So if the sidebar was the same height as the nav, it wouldn't move anywhere because there's nowhere for it to move to. So you just have to remember that the parent container determines how long it sticks for and make sure there's enough room for it to move. The browser support for this is Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, not IE. If you're worried about IE, I'm going to tell you right now, don't be worried about it. I have never come across a situation where sticky was critical functionality. Most of the time, it's used to stick ads, and nobody gives a shit about that. So just don't support it in IE 11. The browser will just ignore the CSS, so you can just put it in and leave it. So we started off here with our beautiful, proper, structured HTML, and we ended up here. I added in a dog logo at the top. It's an SVG. I couldn't help myself. It's very cute. But we basically went through and added in all of the things that we needed, one step at a time, to create our final page. It ended up being 174 lines of CSS. I said we'd do it in under 200, and when I picked that value, it was a guess, and then I was pretty happy when it came at 174. There are a few extra things in here that I didn't mention because I didn't have time to go through it all, like the lists and that kind of thing, some extra stuff to make it responsive. But with this CSS, you can create a bunch of different layouts. I really just wanted an excuse to show you more pictures of my dog. This one I particularly like because he's got a big bone. Anyway, you can do a bunch of different stuff with the same kind of CSS. You might find that you don't have to add anything else, or you just have to add a little bit of extra CSS in order to get it to work. So instead of loading in thousands of lines of Bootstrap, you could just write a few simple little things to get you most of the way there. And it is something you can absolutely do. Starting with a really strong foundation and then building upon it will make it easier to maintain. The biggest problem that I found developers have with CSS isn't CSS itself, it's the way that it's been implemented. Because if you've got a huge code base, regardless of what the technology is, it's hard to maintain. And the more you add onto it without taking stuff away, the harder it gets to maintain. So if you can keep it as small as possible, it's going to be much easier for you to work with. So on that note, thanks very much. Here are a bunch of resources. Highly recommend MDN. It literally gives you everything that you need. CSS Tricks is also awesome for Flexbox and Grid. And if you have any questions, if there's anything you specifically have a requirement for that you don't know how to do, please feel free to tweet me, or as I said, I'll be around. You can come and talk to me about it as well. The front end, it might not be something that you work on all the time, but it's something you can absolutely do, and you might start to enjoy it after a while if you give it a bit of a whirl. There's lots of fun things you can do on the front end, so you should get involved and have a go and have some fun with it. Thanks.